our celebration, we actually have two alumni from Asian American Studies who are now on the City Council of Daly City. So if we just get one more member on the City Council from Asian American Studies, we have a supermajority, and they could pass, like a wall around Daly City, or they could make Tagalog the official language, or rice the official food. But I'll pass it over to council members Manalo and Dasmagwa. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Happy 50th anniversary. And really such an honor to be here today. As mentioned, as the Asian American Studies major, that was my roots. I take that with me when I'm creating policy and governing, and it's really through many of you that were the original strikers and really were on the forefront. So thank you for your legacy, because from your struggle, we are here and we would like to continue that. So thank you very much. We do have a commendation for the San Francisco State University's 50th anniversary of Asian American Studies. Whereas the Asian American Studies Department, the largest of 5 departments in the unit of College of Ethnic Studies at San Francisco State University, was created as a result of the 1968 Black Student Union Third World Liberation Front student strike, the longest student strike in the United States history. Woo! And whereas 3 Asian American SF state student organizations, the PACE, Philippine American Collegiate Endeavor, I was part of that when I was here, Intercollegiate Chinese for Social Action, ICSA, and the Asian American Political Alliance, AAPA, were primary new members of the Third World Liberation Front. And whereas the BSU and the Third World Liberation Front issued 15 demands, led picket lines, rallies, protests, and shutdowns of all the campuses, which were followed by mass arrests, beatings, and the repression by the administration and the local law enforcement and courts. My colleague, Dr. Das Makwal.
Whereas the strike concluded with the establishment of Asian American Studies in the College of Ethnic Studies, the only such college in the nation. And where Asian American Studies and SF State has grown to become the largest Asian American Studies department in the country, currently staffed with 16 tenured track faculty, mounting over 50 undergraduate and graduate courses each semester, and continuing the legacy of community engagement. And where Asian American Studies and SF State is hosting the MacArthur Fellows, Viet Nguyen and Anmy Lee, to highlight the flourishing of Vietnamese American arts and culture since the student movements in the 1960s. Okay. Now, therefore, Daly City commemorates the 50th anniversary of the BSU Third World Liberation Front strike, and recognizes the historic and contemporary contributions of Asian American Studies at SF State.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, council members. We also are fortunate to have Alan Long. He's a representative from Supervisor Gordon Marr's office. Gordon is another big supporter of Asian American Studies and most recently elected for this district. So let's welcome Alan.
Hello, everybody. I'm Alan, and I'm here to represent Supervisor Gordon Marr, who was recently elected to be supervisor for District 4, the Sunset District. And I'm very honored to be here to be representing Gordon, to be here to present this certificate to the Asian American Studies Department today. I know the mentors that I've worked with, Supervisor Eric Marr and Supervisor Gordon Marr, both of them have been very influenced by the work of Asian American Studies, and it's helped develop their sense of social justice and passion for helping out our communities of color in San Francisco and across the United States. The work that the Asian American Studies Department here does, and the strike that happened half a century ago, continues to live on in so many activists and continues to guide the conscience for so many people across the country, across the nation, and it continues to be something that shines a light on how we can continue to move forward and fight for the APIs, fight for African Americans, fight for Latinos, and continue pushing the boundaries for our country to move forward. I remember when I took my Asian American Studies class at community college when I attended there, and it was something that made me grow as a person, and it helped me become a more conscious person about social justice. The strike that we're here commemorating and remembering today is so important. And on behalf of Supervisor Gordon Marr and the San Francisco Board of Supervisors, I wish to present your department with a certificate of honor.
Okay, if we turn out the lights up, please. So I just, this is probably the largest event since a strike at San Francisco State. And if we could turn off the house lights, I want to see how many of you are actually, get out of the house. How many of you, raise your hands if you're Asian American Studies majors? Woo, look at that. And how many of you have taken Asian American Studies classes in general? Wow. Well, you know, tonight we're fortunate to have two winners of the MacArthur Award. And the MacArthur Award, if you don't know, is actually called the Genius Grant. And every year when the MacArthur Award comes out, you know, fellow Falcon and I, we talk about it, and we're wondering, when are we going to get our award? And I think something is wrong with State's mail. And so, but Viet Nguyen wrote about winning the award, and he said, a lot of people think of it as an individualized, personal award of genius, but he looked at it as a different way. He actually graciously said it's because of the collective genius of Asian Americans, the distinctive character of Asian Americans, the spirit of resistance that enabled him to win the award. So this is actually a collective genius award. So all you who are Asian American Studies majors, you can go home and your professor, tell your parents your professor said you're a genius. And you know, tell your accounting friends they're marketable, and your nursing friends, yeah, they may be competent, but you guys are geniuses. So I'd like to start off, today's a day of remembrance, and we want to recall that we're sitting now on Ohlone lands, and that we can't forget that we, as Asian Americans, are also settler colonizers, and that we're in participants of this displacement of people that's going on even today. We also want to remember, as Asian Americanists, that today is the 77th anniversary of the Executive Order 9066, where President Roosevelt issued the executive order to put Japanese Americans into American concentration camps. And again, that's going on again today with family separations at the border, with mass Southeast Asian deportations. So we in Asian American Studies, we remember these things. They do not leave us, they're not part of our collective amnesia, but they're actually part of our collective history, part of our collective consciousness. And we don't forget, because we also remember that we're also part of a history of resistance and change. And that's why we'd like to honor the 1968 and 69 strike tonight, and the founding of Asian American Studies. Actually, can we turn up the lights again? Because we actually have a couple of people who are in the strike. Judge Ron Kittichai, he was the first chairperson of the Third World Liberation Front. If you could turn up the lights. We have Lorraine Chu. If anybody who is part of the strike, can you please stand up? So for me, it is a real honor to be standing among living heroes, to be able to speak to them and to learn from them, and so we thank you. In fact, I actually have to acknowledge Connie and Jean in the back. They're selling books, but they said they organized the first Asian American lit classes and the Asian American women's classes here at San Francisco State, so let's also thank them. So we also want to thank our other co-sponsors, especially the MacArthur Foundation and Aspire, the College of Ethnic Studies, the San Francisco State School of Art, San Francisco Department of English. And we also especially want to thank the Asian American MA students and the classes of Asian Americans 216, 370, and 372. They've been volunteering for this event, and they'll be cleaning up after you, so please thank them. So like our council member said, this strike lasted 5 months and started in November 6th and ended on March 21st. And it was made up, initiated by the Black Student Union and the Third World Liberation Front. So here are the three groups that were represented by Asian Americans. It was the Asian American Political Alliance, Intercollegiate Chinese for Social Action, and the Filipino American Collegiate Endeavor. So if you can see in this photo here, it's one of the first classes. They didn't just have classes for San Francisco State. They took the classes into the community. So this was in the basement of the I Hotel. And this was the first Chinese American studies class taught by Alan Wong. And so they had to sit in bar chairs. So when it first started, there were 17 courses, and we actually have the first professor of Japanese American Studies here, Professor Matsushita, so go greet him afterwards. And there are 17 courses. Today, we're the largest department in the nation with 61 courses offered this semester. So San Francisco State students are really fortunate to have such a range. We teach Filipino classes, Khmer classes. I teach a class on environmental justice. It's really specific. So we teach over 2,500 students a semester. We have 67 majors, 17 MA students, and our MA students, a third of them go into PhD programs, and they teach most of the classes here at our lectures are mostly from our program. We're teaching ethnic studies at City College, at Laney, and so we're the primary pipeline for ethnic studies in the region. We have 16 tenure track faculty. Please greet them and thank them as well. To show again a little bit more about the growth of Asian American Studies, the book on the right, Migrant Returns, was written by Professor Eric Peter and just won the National Book Award from the Association of Asian American Studies. We also have on sale in the back by Third World Liberation Front striker Juanita Tamayo-Lot, one of our distinguished alumni. She wrote a book called Golden Children, Legacy of Ethnic Studies. And again, you could get that book here and actually meet her live in person, have her sign it, so she'll be in there in the back. Yeah, this is our commercial break. We're also for sale, showing the growth of Asian American Studies. We have this entrepreneurial spirit. One of our faculty, Valerie So, is producing a full-length feature film called The Love Boat Taiwan. So, to help fund that film, we're selling boba at good prices. And finally, to illustrate how Asian American Studies has continued in the spirit of solidarity and collaboration, our department, San Francisco State, is working with UC Berkeley, and Harvey Dong up there, who's selling the books, and B. Dong. They started ethnic studies at Berkeley. So I'm writing a book with Harvey, and we have collaborators with UCLA, and together we're writing a book that's called Mountain Movers, Student Activism and the Emergence of Asian American Studies. And this book is actually targeted to be for ethnic studies curriculum on the statewide level. So that shows the growth of ethnic studies, that now it's going to be a statewide requirement, and students need to learn about our histories and will learn about our histories. So, congratulations for being part of the 50th birthday of Asian American Studies. It's grown a lot, and we want to continue on the legacy of our founders. We want to really acknowledge them, that without their work, without their struggle, without their perseverance, we wouldn't be able to sit here today to take all these classes and to learn to be agents of change like they were. So thank you. To moderate our program, we have our Professor Isabel Palau. She's a full professor teaching Vietnamese American Studies. She's also the co-director of DVAN with Professor Viet Nguyen. So let's welcome Professor Palau.
So thank you for being here. I'm going to try to be brief. Well, one thing I want to say, I teach Vietnamese American literature, and one of the premise of ethnic studies is, as scholars, we have to identify some problem, right, in our communities. And, I teach literature, I do that through literatures. But it's not enough, right? Once we identify the problem, we need to fix the problem. So in my scholarship, right, I say, well, Vietnamese American stories are not, always visible, right, or not often heard. And sometimes writers feel certain pressure to write about, the refugee experience in a way that serves as resolutions from the outcome of the Vietnam War. So 10 years ago, and then teaching at San Francisco State, one thing we're trying to do is to be relevant to the communities and and also what we teach to be relevant to our students. When I started to teach here 20 years ago, it was really nothing in San Francisco in the Bay Area about Vietnamese American cultural productions. And I said, well, how I'm going to practice my ethnic studies. So actually 10 years ago, what I did, I said, well, I called Viet Nguyen here, and before I make the formal introductions, I just want to share with you something very few people know about Viet Nguyen, is that I called him and I said, well, Viet, we both understand these problems. Can you join me to try to fix these problems and start an organization that make visible Vietnamese Americans' stories, and also to create space so that writers can create in their own terms. And we're going to do this by promoting writers and cultural producers from all over the world, outside of Vietnam. Are you game? Are you in? And Viet said right away, he said, yes, I'm in. So this is the Diasporic Vietnamese Artists Network. So I'm just going to go very quickly to what we do now, because for 10 years we did a lot of film festival, art exhibit, publications and readings throughout the country and outside these countries. And now we're focusing on writers. So very quickly, Divan. So our goal and purpose, to integrate Vietnamese American perspective in society by promoting and supporting writers and poets of the diaspora. We value self-determination, empowerment, education and healing, and we emphasize collaboration, dialogues and explorations. We do public events, like in San Jose last summer, the Art Museum. This one at the first Asian American Literary Festival in the Smithsonian. We had 2 panels. The next event is going to be in New York in March. We have a group that supports Vietnamese women writers specifically. This is a picture of our last event, also at the San Jose Museum. This one is us, the group of women's writers at the public libraries in Paris, and here Viet stand as a babysitter and introduced us. We also have writing retreats for a group of writers to engage in dialogues. We have 1-month writing retreats for emerging writers. This is the first one. This one is going to be for Viet Nguyen in June. We publish Troubling Borders, bringing together Southeast Asian women writers and artists in this book. It's right here. And we have new, publication projects. We have this blog that Viet started and managed for 10 years, and now Dalstrong managing it. We cannot do this without interns volunteers who are here. You will see them. Of course, all our public, everything we do is free to the writers and to the publics. And we have fundraisers. If you want to participate, you can go to the table over there after we're done and participate. Or if you want to have a private dinner with Viet Nguyen in May, you can also sign up. Okay, I'm going to do done with this. Thank you. So this is, you know, I say like Viet Nguyen is an ethnic studies person, right? He walks the walk. He's putting theory into practice. So as you know, his novel, The Sympathizers, is a New York Times bestseller and won the Pulitzer Prize for fiction. I'm not going to read all his awards because it's too many, and we want to hear from them. His other books are Nothing Ever Dies, Vietnam and the Memory of War, and Race and Resistance, Literature and Politics in Asia America. He's a university professor, the Harold Arnold Chair of English, and a professor of English, American Studies, Ethnicities, and Comparative Literature at the University of Southern California. His current book is a best-selling short story collection, The Refugees. Most recently, he has been the recipient and fellowship from the Guggenheim and Mark Arthur Foundations and the Prix du Meilleur Livre Étranger. For the Sympathizer, is a critic at large for the Los Angeles Times and a contribution opinion writers for the New York Times. Viet Nguyen invited Anmy Lee to participate in this dialogue. Anmy Lee is a Vietnamese-American photographer who was born in Saigon, Vietnam. She was evacuated as a political refugee to the US in 1975 at the end of the war. Lee studied biology at Stanford University, then receiving an MFA from Yale University in 1993. Between 1994 and 1998, she made several trips back to Vietnam to rediscover and photograph her native countries in peacetime. Since then, Lee has explored the military conflict that have framed the last half century of American history, the war in Vietnam and the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. But she approached these events obliquely. Instead of addressing a subject by creating reportage of actual conflict, the photograph places where war is psychologically anticipated, processed, and relieved. Vietnam War reenactment in Virginia and North Carolina, and events ashore explores coastal and maritime locations around the world when the US Navy is stationed to train for and deploy in current and potential conflicts. Her latest work, Silent General, is inspired by Walt Whiteman's Specimen Days and its hybrid mix of journalism, poetry, and autobiography. This project was introduced by the Whitney Biennial in 2017. And she also has several solo exhibitions. But I think I'm going to stop here because we really have a short time and I really want to make space for our speakers to present today some of their work, and then we're going to have a discussion.
Thank you so much for those introductions. Good evening, San Francisco State. It's such an honor and a privilege to be here tonight participating in the 50th commemoration of the Third World Strike and the founding of ethnic studies. And I speak about that because when I went to school at Berkeley a long, long time ago, I was also an ethnic studies major. And I had grown up in San Jose, which is really diverse and multicultural neighborhood, but nevertheless, I did not know what I was missing until I came to Berkeley. And I stepped foot on the Berkeley campus, and I was immediately radicalized, okay? Because I received a very similar education to what the Asian American Studies majors and the ethnic studies majors receive here at San Francisco State. So I came to Berkeley. I immediately started taking Asian American Studies classes. I learned about concentration camps for Japanese Americans, which I never even heard of before. I joined the Asian American Political Alliance, and I was immediately arrested, engaging in political protests in imitation of the Third World Strike. So we honored our forebears in the Third World Strike, and I credit what they were doing 50 years ago with the intellectual transformations and the political transformations that I underwent as a college student that helped me turn me eventually into a scholar and a writer. And I want to talk a little bit about what the Third World Strike meant to me back then and still means to me today, because thinking back to what the students were doing, it was radical back then. It's still radical today. Because what were they arguing for? They were arguing that the Vietnam War was wrong, that the Vietnam War was morally wrong, that it was politically wrong, that it was a racist war. And they were connecting everything that was happening with the Vietnam War with what was happening here in the United States. They were arguing that there was racism here in this country, that this was a country that was built on the legacy of colonization, that there was still radical inequality, and that somehow what was happening here was directly feeding into the Vietnam War as well. And we've tended to forget about that. We've tended to forget that back then, what Asian Americans stood for and what the people who were participating in the Third World Strike stood for was not just anti-racism, there was also anti-war, anti-imperialism, and it was radical. It was deeply influenced by Marxism and Maoism as well. Now, for me, I found that to be tremendously inspiring, but there was also something of a conflict for me, because I had come to this country as a refugee from the Vietnam War. I was born in 1971, and in 1975, when the war ended, my family happened to be on the losing side of the conflict. So we came here as refugees. And if you know anything about the Vietnamese refugees who came here to this country, you'll know they're deeply anti-communist. So for me, growing up in a deeply anti-communist community and feeling tremendous empathy for everything that had happened to Southern Vietnamese people and to Vietnamese refugees made me feel conflicted when I became an Asian American Studies major. An ethnic studies major who was dealing with Asian Americans, and when I was thinking about the legacies of the Third World Strike. Because there were some people in the Asian American movement and in the Third World Strike who were deeply opposed to South Vietnam and felt that the South Vietnamese people were puppets of the Americans. These were two radically opposed visions, and I had to try to make sense out of for myself how to reconcile these two competing visions. And it would take me a long time to do that, a long time to work through that as a scholar and as a writer. So I just want to lead you through a few points that I arrived at after a lot of struggle and conflict with myself. And it's through this book called Nothing Ever Dies, Vietnam and the Memory of War. And I'm just going to talk about one portion of it that deals with memory, which seems very relevant today as we're remembering the Third World Strike and everything that it represents. And for me, what I was trying to do in this book was to think about how do we ethically remember? Because I grew up feeling that as a Vietnamese American, as a Vietnamese refugee, I was living in this country where Vietnam was the name of a war and not a country. In other words, when Americans said Vietnam, they didn't think of Vietnamese people, they didn't think of a country, they thought of a war. And I thought that was unethical. Growing up among Vietnamese people, I could not help but feel what they felt, everything that they had lost, all the people, all the memories, all their identities have been lost with the end of the Vietnam War. So it was unethical, I thought, that Americans were remembering it in this way. So I had to think through that. I had to think through what that meant. So for me, when I think about ethical memory, the first model of ethical memory that I think of is the importance of remembering our own. This is a very natural and human tendency. Americans want to remember their own. That's why when they think about the Vietnam War, they don't think about Vietnamese people. They think about Americans. But the irony is that the Vietnamese refugees who came to this country and who were forgotten here by Americans did exactly the same thing. They were only interested, as far as I could tell, in remembering their own as well. And I had to come to grips with that. I had to recognize that this was ethical too. If we did not remember our own, who would? If Vietnamese refugees and Vietnamese Americans did not remember their own history and what had happened to them, who would remember them? Because Americans had forgotten them. And if you go to Vietnam, you'll realize that the Vietnamese people there, they also want to remember their own, which means that they want to obliterate and to erase the South Vietnamese who fought against them. And this was a very compelling model, because this is also what I think many of us engage in as well when we celebrate the Third World Strike. We want to remember our own. We want to remember our heroes and everything that they had done. And that's a normal human tendency. But it's not enough. And so I felt that there was another model that was important to memory, the ethics of remembering others. And this I felt was very central to Asian American studies and to ethnic studies. that much of our work is not just about remembering us, it's about remembering others. Our project in ethnic studies is about solidarity. It's not just working for us and who we are, it's recognizing that Asian Americans have connections with African Americans, with Chicanos and Latinos, with Native Americans. We're all in this together in this struggle to liberate this country and to engage in a project for a more just and equal society. And in the ethics of remembering others, the liberal version, we remember that we are human. And we remember that others are human as well. And if you want to think about this in terms of presidential politics, the ethics of remembering others is the ethical model of Obama and Clinton. The problem with the ethics of remembering others in this liberal version, though, is that it never stops us from going to war. Under the Obama administration, despite the fact that we remember others, despite the fact that we embrace diversity and multiculturalism, which are values that Clinton, the candidate, embraces as well, we're still a country that is built on a military-industrial complex. We're still a country that engages in drone strikes. We're still a country that has 800 military bases all over the world. So the ethics of remembering others in this liberal version, even though it's good for us who believe in diversity and multiculturalism, is still perfectly capable of being used to wage war. So there's another model of remembering others, the radical version. And the radical version is what motivates the anti-war movement. We see it in the movement against the Vietnam War. We see it again in the movements against the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and so on. And in the ethics of remembering others, we are the ones who are inhuman, whereas they are the human ones. And by this, I mean the anti-war movement in the United States did a very powerful thing. It reminded Americans that they're not the good guys. It's impossible to be the good guys when we dropped more bombs on Southeast Asia during the Vietnam War than was dropped on all of Europe during World War II. And so the anti-war movement and the Third World Strike was arguing that this was inhuman behavior that we were engaging in. We were killing civilians. And this was very powerful. But for me, as a Vietnamese person, I had to wonder, where do I fit into these ethical models of remember? Because in this ethical model of remembering others where we are the inhuman ones and they are the human ones, I was one of these Vietnamese people who were the others. I was one of these Vietnamese people who was being told, you're the ones who are the victims of the Americans. And I thought to myself, that's not completely true. That doesn't feel right to me. Because there's still something problematic about this model of remembering others. Americans have used this model, the anti-war movement has used this model to continue to center over and over again the American experience. So even as we remember Americans as being inhuman and others, whether it's Vietnamese or Iraqis or Afghans as being the human ones, we continue to return to the central drama of the American story. That's why even today, for those who oppose, Americans who oppose the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, they still want to talk mostly about Americans. How much do we know about Iraqis or Afghans today? We probably know as little about them as the Americans of the 1960s knew about the Vietnamese people. So even if I'm opposed to the American wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, I can't participate in this model of remembering others in this way, because I have to remember that those others don't see themselves as others. The Vietnamese never saw themselves as others. The Vietnamese saw themselves at the center of their own story. Iraqis and Afghans see themselves at the centers of their own stories as well. And one of the problems with these models of ethically remembering others is that the others never come across as fully human. The Vietnamese during the Vietnam War in the American imagination were either the Viet Cong, the villains, or they were the innocent victims. And that was not reality to me. I grew up in that Vietnamese refugee community knowing that that kind of polarization did not speak to how the Vietnamese saw themselves as human beings. I had to come up with something more complex for myself as a scholar and for myself as a writer as well. Because when I thought back to the Vietnam War, what did I see? I grew up in a Vietnamese refugee community in which I saw Vietnamese people believing themselves to be utterly innocent. They looked at the Vietnam War, the Vietnamese refugees here, and they thought of themselves as the victims. That if they were the victims of Vietnamese communism, they were the victims of American abandonment, and they were. But I knew that couldn't be the full story. If you know anything about war, you know that no side is ever, hardly ever, only the victims. Everybody in a war does terrible things, and everybody in a war has terrible things done to them. I wanted to come up with an ethical model of remembering that would embrace that complexity and those contradictions. And that's the final model, the ethics of recognition. What do we recognize? That we are human and inhuman, and they are human and inhuman as well. I wanted to talk about Vietnamese people not as victims or as victimizers, but as both. I wanted to look at the Vietnamese refugees that I grew up with and recognize everything that they had suffered and been through. But I also wanted to talk about everything that they had done to other people as well. I grew up in a Vietnamese refugee community in which we weren't just the victims. I grew up in a Vietnamese refugee community in which we were traumatized, people were traumatized, and they did terrible things to each other. I grew up in a Vietnamese refugee community in which I knew the Vietnamese soldiers that we celebrated who were marching around in their uniforms at all the traditional events. I know that as soldiers they must have done things that they didn't want to talk about. I grew up in a Vietnamese refugee community in which the violence of the war reverberated throughout that community and manifested itself in violence within our communities and within our homes, the violence that we did to each other. And that complexity was not recognized in the American society. That complexity was not recognized in Vietnam. And that complexity was barely even talked about within the Vietnamese refugee community. I wanted to talk about that in my own work. Recognizing that people are human and inhuman gives them full subjectivity. When we think of ourselves only as victims or victimizers, we don't give each other that kind of subjectivity. When we think about Iraqis and Afghans as being only the victims of American bombing, that's only part of the story. We need to think more about their full complexity. And that's, looking at this model, this is a way by which I try to understand my own work. The Refugees, my short story collection, is really something that fits under the category of the ethics of remembering others. That we are human. I wanted to emphasize the humanity of Vietnamese people. But by the time I got to writing The Sympathizer, that was a novel that embraces the ethics of recognition. I wanted to write a novel in which the Vietnamese were at the center of their story. But what does it mean to be at the center of our story? To be at the center of our story doesn't mean that we're simply people who are things done to us. We are people who do things to others as well. Which is why at the center of The Sympathizer, we have a spy who is an alcoholic, a liar, a womanizer, and ultimately a murderer. So it's completely autobiographical. But I thought, when I was writing that novel, I was watching a lot of TV. I was watching The Sopranos, I was watching Mad Men, I was watching Breaking Bad, I was watching The Wire, and I was like, wow, these shows that Americans are watching about themselves are full of terrible human beings. But no one would look at these shows and think, wow, that represents all of America. We recognize that these represent individual, flawed people in all of their magnificent, tragic complexity. That's what I wanted to do in The Sympathizer. And I think ultimately, the project, for me, the project of ethnic studies should be about that. The project of ethnic studies in the Third World Strike isn't about talking about ourselves simply as the victims of American racism or American imperialism. It's about claiming full subjectivity, which means saying that we're not angels, which means saying we're not one-dimensional, which means recognizing our full subjectivity means claiming for ourselves the full agency of what it means to be human and inhuman at the same time. No population has ever been innocent. And if we are to claim our place in American society, it's not simply by opposing the racism in this society, it's by recognizing that we ourselves are capable of doing terrible things as well. So for me, that was a legacy of what it meant to struggle through the Third World Strike, what it meant to think about everything that ethnic studies and Asian American studies had done. And it was thinking through these kinds of issues, thinking through the stakes of the Third World Strike that let me write the books that I did. So I thank everyone in this room who was an activist during that time, who put their bodies on their line, who were visionaries, who imagined a better society, who imagined a more just society, who were radicals back then or are still radicals today because we still live in an unjust country. Thank you very much.
I'll just start talking. Can you guys hear me? I have, as a visual artist, I've had a pretty a different kind of trajectory. I pretty much work on my own, and it's been a long journey, but I'm sort of glad to find that I think I've joined the resistance. So I wanted to thank Viet for having invited me to join him for this panel, and I'm so glad to meet everyone and to know so much more about what you guys do here. The floodgate for me was when I went to graduate school in photography. I was not trained as an artist, I was trained as a biologist, and when I arrived in graduate school, the big question was, well, you know, you're a pretty great photographer, but you're a Vietnamese woman, you're so interesting, you know, where's your autobiography in all of this? And it was very confusing for me at that point. So this is 1991. You know, my autobiography, so I think of Vietnam, it was so painful. I think of being a refugee, I think of the war. It was very confusing. I had a mixture of memories, I had a mixture of experiences, I had a mixture of movies, text, the news, it was all mixed up and I couldn't make sense out of any of it. And I think the big step for him was to realize that Vietnam was an idea, it was a place, it was a war, it was a sign, a signifier, and it was a real mess, and the best thing was just to embrace the mess. And so I put together a slideshow that is a mixture of pictures that have influenced me, and then pictures that I've made, and you can see that they kind of all join together in this chaos. And so this is news pictures from the war, and I was more interested in the landscape, in the trees. So how do I'm sorry, I use a Mac normally, so just hit the slide. Just press the arrow key, okay, right. No, that didn't work. Done. No, I did that too. Okay, so maybe I need to get this out. Next. And then just use the arrow. This is one of the first pictures I made when I returned to Vietnam in the mid-1990s when Clinton renewed relations with Vietnam and lifted the embargo. This was in the delta of the Mekong, so the swirl of the trees, you know, it connected to me with pictures of helicopters taking off and GIs being airlifted, but instead I put a fictionary family together in this arbor of trees. A lot of pictures of children, of course. So I looked for what I thought would be a life at peace in Vietnam. I think a lot of people really didn't understand. They tried to encourage me to look at the sequels of war. They tried to encourage me to look at modern Vietnam, but I was interested in something that was barely palpable, but I managed to find, and it was about a way of life. This is a family picture. This is an orphan evacuation by the Australians during the Vietnam War. This is a portrait I made of a young woman who was working in the fields in northern Vietnam. I just love the plastic jewelry that she wore, and then of course the pith helmet, which reminded me of the war. This is a picture from Platoon. And this is a family picture of me and my kids. We were visiting some friends, and they had tons of guns from when they were growing up, and my kids just pulled them all out. And it was really extraordinary, and somebody made a picture. And I think it all makes sense to me if you understand that within this mess, you know, it's a wellspring of inspiration. This is another picture made in Vietnam in the early 1990s. You know, moments that I remembered or that I was told about. My grandmother, of course, like you all know, chewed betel leaves and the areca nuts, and this is the way they're grown. I'd never seen that before. And so the gracefulness of this young woman and her mother growing this community garden was very impressive to me. The way we worked the land, I always thought that the land carried the history, carried the culture in ways that perhaps a person may not be able to do it so well. So I spent quite a number of years photographing in Vietnam, and the obvious elephant in the room was the issue of war, and I had avoided it. I came across, I learned about these guys who reenacted the Vietnam War in North Carolina and Virginia, and I approached them and wanted to photograph them. I had no idea what I would do with it. I thought it was a scary thing. It took me a really long time, but I was finally invited, and I had to be in character. I think they gave me various choices. You could be a photographer, you could be a nurse, you could be a Viet Cong. And I asked them, well, what would give me the most flexibility? And they said, if you're a Viet Cong and you're caught and you go on the other side, then you can see both sides. And I said, all right, tell me what to do. So you'll see what I end up having to do. So once I get there, you know, I have to decide what kind of pictures do you want to make. And of course, we all know this picture, and those guys reenact the picture, and of course you have to make the picture. But I realized that I was not interested in recreating this horror that we grew up with. I was looking for something else. And so what is it that I'm looking for? I think I'm looking at the way the Vietnam War was a myth, how it was misunderstood. These guys are actually reenacting it because it was so seared in their imagination. They grew up watching the Vietnam War movies. And so all of that was very interesting to me, and that's what I wanted to explore. And this is me as a Viet Cong. It was one of the creepiest things that I had to do. I mean, once you start doing it, then it's not a big deal. And this is, of course, a real Viet Cong, much more confident. This is one of the more complicated pictures that I was able to set up with them. So they would come on the weekends, reenact, and then go back to whatever they were doing. I think that they were looking for something, and I was looking for something else, and we sort of came together and made these pictures. They're very pastoral. I was, again, not interested in recreating this horror of war, but I was interested in exploring their psyche, America's psyche, the fascination with the war. I was also interested in this idea of strategy and terrain and landscape, because landscape was something that we talked about a lot when we spoke about Vietnam. You know, this idea of tourism in Vietnam and the popularization of these Cu Chi tunnels, you know, was very impressive to me. And those tunnels came back in a lot of the work that I did. This is one of the more recent pictures from a recent project called Silent General. There are Civil War trenches that I photographed, and they're part of a larger project. News pictures of the bombing of Vietnam, and of course I was very marked by those, as well as living through Tet 68 in Saigon. Pretty much after I got tired of working with the reenactors and thought that I was at some sort of Disneyland, I was craving for something more real, more serious. We invaded Iraq. And immediately my instinct was that I needed to go to Iraq and be there and witness the moment. And you know, I was thinking, you know, I'm barely getting over Vietnam, and I think we're getting into another war, and we're bringing all these young people there. I'm thinking of the Iraqis, and it was a really big mess. Fortunately, I made it was a little late in the game when I decided to go to Iraq. Everyone had been there previously waiting in Kuwait, and I was on a wait list for becoming an embed. And I was still hoping that I would get to go at some point. But while I was waiting, I came across pictures of the Marine Corps training outside of Los Angeles in 29 Palms, where Joshua Tree is. And I thought that, it could look like part of Afghanistan. So after doing Vietnam in North Carolina, why not do Iraq outside of LA? And so and this was my first experience with gaining access to a military compound, to something that's difficult to have access to. I wrote to 29 Palms and asked to be invited to photograph, and developed a relationship with them, and I worked there for about 3 years. Working there was really important for me, and I sort of completely lost interest in going to Iraq. It was important because I was photographing training, and so I had a physical and emotional distance from real war. And I realized how important that was. You know, I had read Susan Sontag, and she, in The Pain of Others, she wrote so well about how sometimes when something is too horrific and too painful, you just close your eyes and you can't think. And in this place, I felt that I had the space to think about how we get into a situation that leads you to war, how we prepare for war, or are we prepared to deal with the consequences? All of those things I felt that we could think about. And I thought that these pictures could bring a different perspective of war. And perhaps, this is also the area where Walker Evans surveyed the West. I'm sure there were conflicts with Native Americans. And I think the idea of history, the history of war, could also be another element in this work. This is me and my camera on the helmets. Catherine Leroy, who was a French photographer during the Vietnam War. Women at War, Women at Work. In the next project, I traveled with the military. I became interested in the maritime and coastal operations. After leaving 29 Palms, one of the generals told me, "Well, do you want to come see us practice at sea before we go to Iraq?" And I said, "Sure, why not?" I still think of myself a landscape photographer, so after the desert, I thought that I would look at the ocean. So I embarked on this 9-year project where I followed the Navy and the Marine Corps all over the world, on all the continents. And of course, I didn't think about it, but my obvious reason for doing that was that my mother was evacuated on an aircraft carrier, and I went on aircraft carriers, destroyers. I was in Antarctica. I went to the North Pole in a submarine. I did it all, but it's just not for traveling for traveling's sake. I wanted to understand what this huge military complex was, this industrial complex. I was interested. I found out that they're just not out there for conflict. They're also trying to collect information, humanitarian missions. They support science. A lot of great efforts, but also a lot of blunders. The idea of how the military controls its image. This is in Guantanamo Bay. The irony is all over. So they try to do a lot of great things, but they miss the mark often. I also try to, I think we'll be talking about it later, the pictures from 29 Palms a little further back. And here, as I got to know the military a little bit more, I was interested in the personal stories and wanted to get closer, wanted to make more portraits. I'm also interested in the way the military deals with other cultures, in Africa, in Asia, but also civilian cultures. This idea of coming to help, it's a fine line between helping and invading, perhaps. And this is right after a huge earthquake in Haiti. I think that it's the way the American military behaves, the physicality. They come to help, but I think the way they inhabit the space, the way they invade the space is so obvious that it's this really small, fine line. I stuck around long enough for the military to actually return to Vietnam and trained with the Vietnamese. And so it was a kind of an opportunity for me to create so many pictures and pull from my memories of growing up in Vietnam. And this is, of course, Full Metal Jacket. You know, it's sort of like you remember things and you pull it out and you look for something else. And so it's never quite a direct line as to how something inspires you, but they do inspire you. I was too young to remember this. It was 1963 and I was born in 1960. But it's an image that was seared in my memory. I have to say I had not seen it for at least 10 years. But I made this picture, and it was on a hospital ship off the coast of Vietnam. The Americans were going back to Vietnam to try to win hearts and minds, and brought a number of patients on, and this young nun came on the ship, and I kind of followed her, and I wanted to photograph her, and then I put this soldier next to her. So you can sort of see what sort of relationship is created here. And the relationship between what's subjective and what's objective in a picture. So I'm as interested in the gestures, the uniform, the way the heads are shaved, the way they represent opposite things, but I'm also interested in what could be suggested beyond the frame of the picture. And I think this is sort of like the closing of the circles, the formal ceremony of the Americans returning to Vietnam, and this idea about lessons learned or not learned. And I think I will stop here so we can start our conversation.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Yeah? No? You can't hear me? Hello? Yes, okay. Well, I had a lot of questions, but I think we're running out of time, so I'm just going to narrow down to 3 questions, right, and then open for Q&A. And some of the questions I had were answered. So, but I'm just, yeah. So, I'm just going to start with you, Viet. In your book, Nothing Ever Dies, you call for an art, as you say, that celebrates the humanity of all sides and acknowledge the inhumanity of all sides, including our own. You want art to enact powerful memory and to speak truth to power, even when our side exercise and abuse that power. And you borrow from Toni Morrison's phrase, nothing ever dies. You know, by using that phrase, you remind us that this insight is both terrifying and hopeful. This deep reflective stance and sharp vision seems very crucial, especially in a world in which we are continually forced to live intimately now with fear and hate, and thus at the risk to accept this as normal and eternal. I'm going to ask you to please extend on this vision and explain how you arrived at this clarity. Some of which you did a little bit, but maybe a little bit.
Well, you know, I think as eventually I became a writer. You know, when I was a student, I was a scholar. And, you know, even as a scholar within the tradition of ethnic studies, one of the things that I struggled with was that, you know, there's still ideological conformity even within academia. So, you know, ethnic studies has produced great scholarship, but it also produces a certain kind of ideological conformity where we're opposed to American imperialism, for example, we're opposed to racism, but we're not necessarily so good at looking within ourselves and looking within our own contradictions. And for me, that's absolutely necessary when you're a writer. You have to confront contradictions. You have to go to unpleasant places. You have to go to, you can't be aligned. You can't be a conformist, right? That means that you have to be critical of everybody, critical of your opponents, but you're also critical of your own allies, because your commitment is to truth or to art or whatever idealistic notions that you have. And I felt that that was the breakthrough that I needed to make, was again, not simply celebrating humanity, but to recognize inhumanity at the same time. And it's easy to recognize the inhumanity of our enemies. It's a lot more difficult to recognize our own inhumanity, whether it's within us or within our family or within our country. You know, so the Sympathizer, for example, you know, it's a novel that works for some people and doesn't work for others because every side in the Vietnam War has found a reason to hate it. There are some Vietnamese Americans who refuse to read the book because it's written from the perspective of a communist spy. They just won't engage because communists are evil. how can we possibly read a book by communists? And the communists are not evil. There are some communists who are evil, but not all of them. They're human beings just like the South Vietnamese. And then there are the book is banned, and the book is not being translated in Vietnam because the Vietnamese government doesn't want to hear the critique of Vietnamese communism. And I still get letters from Americans saying, you know, if you hate this country so much since you wrote this book, why don't you leave? But that's what it means to be critical of everybody's inhumanity, is to bring all of that up because people don't want to hear about their own contradictions. And again, that's one of the, you know, in Nothing Ever Dies, there's a section where I talk about Anmy's work because I see some of this in action, that there's this willingness to engage in this sort of deep empathy with all sides. You know, you go to Vietnam, you deal with Vietnamese people, but you also engage with the American military. And that, I think, would throw some people off. They're like, how can you do this? How can you both empathize with the Vietnamese and
war was
also
so
empathize with the
horrific.
soldiers?
How could you even?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But that was one of the reasons why I love your work so much and why I thought it was really exemplary of the kind of art that I'm interested in, the art that's committed to not to ideology, but to looking at empathetically at the complexity of human beings.
So using like empathy to understand others, but also being very honest about oneself, and which is sometimes even hardest to do. You know, this is a dialogue, and then you refer to also to Anmy Lee's work. I'm going to read a little bit of something you wrote about her work, and maybe you have a chance to respond. So in Nothing Ever Dies, Viet reads your photograph as taken from a military point of view, and by doing so, he says, you capture in this image the essentially unhuman face of the war machine, which transcends human being and human bodies into something sublime, something seductive, and is man-made beauty and horror. And you also add that your gaze, marked by wide angle, is important because it confronts war by taking a high ground both morally and strategically. By morally, it means one that calls for forgiveness while being reflective of one's own culpability in the past, present, and future conflicts. By strategically, it means to bring to consciousness the vastness of our war machine as well as the one of the enemy in conjunction with peace. So just want to know, was this your intent in taking those photographs, and did you agree with his readings? And would you like to add something to Viet's interpretations?
Well, I think I never got a chance to properly thank Viet for writing about my work. He was one of the first people who seriously thought about it, and of course, as a scholar and as a writer, he wrote so elegantly about it. And I speak about my work through process. So it's much more intuitive, and it's much more about how do I feel about something and how do I want to make it work. I think for me it was always the fact that I didn't want to be a victim, and I was not interested in making work that was about trauma. And I think visual arts, what we call political work, used to have a much more simple message. You made work about politics in the 70s. You need to be against war or for war, or you need to be for this or against that. You couldn't really talk about a subject in complicated ways, and I wanted to talk about it in complicated ways because I think I was very conflicted about everything. And I think 29 Palms allowed me to do that. And I think just being in the middle fine line was not acceptable to a lot of people. They really wanted to know at the end of a presentation, so how do you feel about the war? But I think using scale, and that's what Viet speaks about so elegantly. So in terms of my process, it's the idea of using scale that allows for that. So actually pulling back. Pictures that I saw growing up in Vietnam, because Americans wanted to show that, wanted to end the war, were so close up than they were about the personal stories. And I was more interested in military activities as they splayed over a landscape. So it's about context. And I think by stepping back, you need to take responsibility for the action. You can't just focus on the action. You need to take responsibility for your origins, for your history. And I think Viet talks about that so well.
One thing you said that I want to pick up on, though, is you didn't want to be a victim. I don't want to be a victim either. Yes, all these Vietnamese people died during the war, but are we just victims? And I wanted to resist that. But to resist that means, again, that you engage with what it means not to be a victim, not to be an object of pity.
But did you know what you would find? I wasn't sure what I would find. I just knew I didn't want to be a victim, and that was scary, you know, to just go down that road. And
no, I didn't know what I wanted. I didn't know what I was going to find either, and that's why I think at the end it was important to see the full agency of the Vietnamese and also the Americans. You know, we have a very good sense of the full agency of Americans because we're constantly exposed to American stories. So we know that Americans can do good things and bad things, and that again, you can't reduce Americans to one or the other. And likewise, that's eventually what I had to discover about the Vietnamese too. And then you said you're in the middle. I think most artists find themselves in the middle because we can't be only committed to ideology. I mean, many of us do believe in things, but we believe in the practice and the art first and foremost.
Right.
That has to come first. Right? That means that we have no allegiance in the end to being Vietnamese first.
Right,
That comes
right.
second, right? And so we end up being in the middle because we can't participate in these slogans about
right, the
either or.
rhetoric, and I'm not interested in being right either, you know, and I'm not interested in debunking somebody else's story. You know, they have their own story, so this is my own story. It may not give you all the answers, but I think also I'm interested in making people ask questions, and I'm not interested in necessarily giving answers.
Well, also about being in the middle, you know, the population that I find myself most empathetic with when I think back to like the Vietnam War or any other conflict are the people who are caught in the middle. I mean, war does terrible things to everybody, but at least if you choose a side, you have the comfort of a side. But if you're in the middle, like if you can see how both sides are flawed, you're really in a tough situation. And so you go back and look at what happened to the Vietnamese people, it was the ones in the middle I thought that were the most tragic, whether it was in North Vietnam or South Vietnam. There were people who didn't want to choose either side because they could see that both sides had deep problems.
Right.
And these were the people who were the most, you know, screwed basically by
Right.
history.
You suffered the most, yeah.
So you have the choice between, you know, like this represented as victim, and so you don't want to be represented as victim, and you want to search for truth. And sometimes, I mean, I've seen in Asian American movie, I mean, I heard actors saying, well, if I don't want to be a victim, then I'd rather be a bad guy, because I only have the choice between a victim and a bad guy. But it seems like, you know, and then, you know, war is seen as something very ugly, and you find, you know, some, you know, ugly versus beauty. But it seems like both of you in your search for truth and not being bound by the pressure to, you know, for acceptance, and not bound by the pressure of the communities to silence you, right? So you have opened, both of you, a third space when you find those complexities. But I remember, Viet, I mean, your work, Race and Resistance, right? Like talking with Asian American Studies, you know, calling into question the framework of examining an Asian American text only in terms of resistance accommodations. You say, you know, that can be a problem, let's find in the complexity. And now with the sympathizers too, looking at this, you know, talking about different access of powers from all sides, as you said. Well, it hasn't always been, as you said, popular, right, and accepted by all sides, and your work too, right? Sometimes you show the, you know, amazing beauty of war, and that must not always be.
It doesn't sit right. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so it's not, and then yet you kept going with it. To find, you know, you have your core. So I just wanted to know where to find that convictions, you know, because you've been informed by the strikes, by ethnic studies, and by the movement of resistance, but you made it your own because this framework really didn't fit your experience and your subjectivity. So both of you push boundaries within ethnic studies and in the communities and in society. But, you know, and then also I want to say, where does that come from? What kept you going? And also, how is it now that you're in such a demand, you know, in the space that was not always welcoming of you, right? So how is it?
Well, you know, I think for me, ethnic studies and the Third World Strike was very much about claiming agency. We were not going to be defined anymore by racist definitions of being a person of color or being Asian American in this country. And so a powerful political platform was enacted, but the problem with political platforms, again, is that they demand conformity. And so if you look at the history of the consequences of the Third World Strike and all that, there's a lot of tensions and all these other things that are going on. But for me as a Vietnamese refugee, one of the things I could never forget was, well, look, the Third World Strike is supporting the Vietnamese Revolution in Vietnam, right? Well, does anybody even remember what happened after the Vietnamese Revolution? I mean, the Vietnamese Revolution was, from their perspective, a great revolution, independence, freedom, all these other kind of things. And then the Vietnamese revolutionaries win, and what do? They put all their enemies in prison. That's wrong. And so I was always, that model of political conformity carried too far always stayed with me, and thought, well, how do we prevent ourselves from doing that? The Third World Strike never, ever got to that moment where it had that capacity. Maybe it did it in a small scale within its own movement. But I always worry, like, what happens if our revolution is actually successful? Will we repeat the mistakes of other revolutions? And how do we not repeat the mistakes of other revolutions? We do not repeat them by being aware of these ethics that I'm talking about, but we also don't repeat them if we pay attention to our artists. Our artists are not committed to ideology, our artists are committed to truth, and part of the truth is we abuse each other, even in the name of good intentions. And so what happened in Vietnam? They put the artists in jail too. The writers and the artists who questioned ideological conformity, they all went to jail. And so that I think was a really crucial lesson for me, is again that what we have to do, those of us who are artists who also believe in things like ethnic studies, we have to walk a very difficult line. We're still inspired by ethnic studies, we're still committed to it, but we're also committed to truth, which means sometimes telling the truth about our own colleagues and our own collaborators and so on. And yes, that makes for an uncomfortable relationship sometimes with our allies, but we have to be committed that if we tell the truth, our allies will come along and understand that too. One thing I would say about your work is that I think that even if you depict the American military, I don't see that necessarily as an endorsement. There's a distinction between, but I think some people get confused.
People
like,
get confused,
you
yes.
take pictures of the American military, you must support the war machine. That's not the same thing.
Yes, I have had a number of people coming up to me and telling me I'm glorifying the military. I don't see it that way. I think people also confuse beauty with a more complicated beauty because the pictures seem beautiful, and it is sometimes very beautiful, like a huge piece of steel. Like those aircraft carriers are amazing. Why should I make them uglier than they are? It doesn't mean that it's all, but it's always about complicated beauty and about showing something but then pulling you back in a different way. So I'm always looking for the fault line. But in terms of persisting, for me it just felt right. What I do is so different from Viet. I don't have all the words, and I chose to only photograph and use very simple titles. But it just felt right, and I think I did photography because I wanted to understand things and see things for myself, and this idea of bringing truth to power and witnessing something. And so I always felt like I was excited to go somewhere new, to ask new questions, to perhaps get an answer. So I just continued, and I think even when things don't work out, something good does pop up, and it sort of encourages you to continue. I don't do any kind of radical type of photography. I work with a large format view camera, and it's pretty much what we call straight photography or documentary style photography. So it's not that radical. So it's within a tradition, and I think I just felt kind of emboldened to continue the work.
So, in a way, your ability to see, to tell your truth, ethnic studies provide this forum, right, of resistance, fight white hegemony, but, it was more complicated for you guys, and you were able to bring that into your work. I have to say, it's a coup, right, that we're sitting here today, 250 years later, because, even the beginning of ethnic studies, a lot of people who were here were anti-war, and here, when South Vietnamese came here and was really, pro-war, because people lost their home because the U.S. stopped the war, right? The war was ended. So it was a vexed relationship with ethnic study with Vietnamese American with ethnic studies. And here, 50 years later, we're all sitting here, so this is amazing moments. So here, taking this space, taking these moments as leaders of, if you can say something about the next 50 years of ethnic studies, since you have this space here, how you will like the field to go toward, because now we say, some people can say, we can afford to talk about the complexities of who we are. And some people, because right now we're also at the time when, we have big bully who's telling, the world of who we are, and some people will say, well, we can't afford to talk about this complexity, it's time to fight. So I wanted to know, within this context today, how do you see yourself, how do you see your role as intellectual, as visual artists, as writers, and, to guide also for us, all of us, to imagine, how the next 50 years may want to look like, with your leadership. Last question.
Maybe I'll start. I think it can be good to be misunderstood. I think that today in a lot of universities you have these safe spaces and areas where everyone's represented and everyone has the ability to speak and be understood, or you want to be understood. But I think being misunderstood can be great because it forces you to be more self-introspective. I mean, and we've all had to contend with being gauged by stereotypes and to be packaged into a simplified understanding of something. But I think being misunderstood forces you to be, to ask yourself questions, to try to understand what your position is, and that's how you step up as well. So I think that we need to have safe spaces, but we still need to struggle, and I think learning from these struggles can be a great thing. So no matter how much we've progressed, I think we need to remember that struggle is a great, gives you momentum.
Well, I think in the next 50 years, some things will stay the same and some things will change. I mean, what's going to stay the same? Is racism going to go away? Is the military-industrial complex going to go away? Is war going to go away? No, they're not going to go away. They're not going to go away because all these things are a part of the United States, deeply embedded in our country. So all of the contradictions that led to the Third World Strike and the formation of ethnic studies in the first place, they're still going to be there. And that's going to make ethnic studies continue to be relevant because our commitment is speaking truth to American power and to American inequality and to American injustice. So we're still going to do the same work. But what's going to change? What's going to change is that the people who ethnic studies deals with will change. When Vietnamese refugees came here in 1975, there were some Asian American activists who didn't want to accept Vietnamese refugees because they thought those people are fleeing from a country, from a war that we oppose. These people are South Vietnamese soldiers, these people are South Vietnamese puppets, they're our enemies, we shouldn't take them into this country. Well, the point is, we did take them into this country, and the confrontation with Vietnamese refugees helped to change what we do in Asian American studies and in ethnic studies. And why is that the case? Because we had to listen to what these people had to say. So ethnic studies has to listen. There are new populations coming in that are not the same as previous generations of immigrants and refugees and colonized people and natives and indigenous people. They're going to come in with new histories, new problems, new struggles, and we have to listen. Whether we're artists or academics or activists, our practice has to be transformed by paying attention to the histories that these people bring with them.
Thank you very much. I think we have some time for questions from the audience. Anybody has questions? We have, do we have questions? Time, Russell, for questions? What? Any questions from the audience? No? So Russell is coming. Oh, yes.
Hello. Hi, thank you both for being here tonight and sharing your stories and your truths. My question is for Anmy Lee. I'm really fascinated by your experience in North Carolina with the soldiers who are reenacting the Vietnam War. I'm curious, what was their motivation for reenacting the war, and did you ever fear for your safety playing the enemy?
I feared for my safety on my first trip because I didn't know them. Their motivation, they call themselves living historians. Sorry. They grew up collecting, badges, and they knew everything about war histories, and I think this was a way for them to live out some of these fantasies. They felt that they did the Civil War, they did the Indian War, I think some of them did World War I, World War II, and they felt it was too far back in history and they wanted to do something more contemporary. So this was 2000 before we invaded Iraq the second time. So they chose Vietnam, which is really odd because it's such a controversial war. There's no, Americans were not the victor. But they played Viet Cong and they played Americans. And it's so interesting in the way economically who plays what is replicated in real life. So the kids who had more money would play the Americans because the American gear was more expensive. And they also tended to be less fit. They were always like up on the hill, sleeping on air mattresses and eating sea rations. And then us, North Vietnamese Army or Viet Cong, we were down sleeping on the ground on hammocks, and we were always hiking up and ambushing them. It was very, very strange in the way we came together. And obviously I needed their help to make the pictures because I was working with the view camera, so you couldn't really run after them and just snap pictures. So I would have to ask them, can you do this, can you do that, and pose and do the whole thing. And they complied because they were happy to do it. It was a very strange experience, I have to say. Especially, being a Viet Cong and being captured, and I think it was very subversive because they would say, okay, scream something in Vietnamese, and I would scream something, and then they'd scream back because they were in character, and they'd say, kill that bitch, and then I'd say, oh my God. And then the guy who said that would walk around the whole weekend apologizing to me. He said, I'm so sorry. It was very, very strange. And of course, I never told my father about doing this. And some of the Vietnamese that I knew who liked my work that I made in Vietnam, when they found out I did this work, completely ignored me from there on. I think Dung Tu Huong, the author, had used some of my work for her books, and as soon as she found out about this work, she just stopped talking to me. Yeah.
Great story.
Any other questions? Yes?
Yeah, well, I want to thank you for doing this work, the pictures, and also your book, The Sympathizer, which is successful in humanizing the story. I think that's valuable, but I think today, 50 years on, if you want, America is in another imperialist crisis, with Venezuela attacking countries, and also the attack on people in Asia, China, as the big enemy. So I think it's 50 years on, the United States is in decline as an empire, and is striking out, and that's how you look at Trump, a reflection of decline, people wanting to make America great again. So I think that we were successful in winning some things in our strike, including ethnic studies, so that the story of immigrants and not, Native Americans, all people could be told, the people that come to this country, who are this country. The other issue that I think has to be addressed is the privatization and corporatization of colleges, because that was one of the issues of the strike for open admissions. Because now the ability of working class students to go to college is threatened. I mean, students are in debt, and it's a struggle to go to college. I mean, $72 a semester when I was going to San Francisco State. It should be that way today. I mean, it should be that way today. I mean, young people should have the right to go to college in this wealthy state, in this wealthy country. So I think the struggle really continues. to get our identity, our history out, but also the struggle of the right for democratic rights for education, which we were fighting for 50 years ago. So that's going to happen again, and it is happening again, but the teachers and the struggle just to get a public education. So thank you.
Well, I agree. I think that, that's when I was saying that nothing has changed in a certain sense, that's what I'm talking about. Like, I think much of what you're talking about today is the reaction against what happened in 1968. That there were these radical movements fomenting a more radical vision about American society, more access, more equality, anti-war, and all that kind of stuff. And so, Make America Great Again is a response to all of that. We're still living with the history that was unleashed by the Vietnam War and by the anti-war movement in this country. And so doing things like making college more expensive is precisely designed to keep people from coming to college and becoming more interested in a more just country. So yes, we have to fight on all those kinds of fronts as well.
Any other question in the back over there? Oh, over here, over here.
One of the things that struck me about South Africa and its coming to terms with its history of apartheid was the Truth and Reconciliation process. And I've often wondered whether that kind of a process, how that could possibly be replicated, and the extent to which it's been replicated in other places, and perhaps replicated here. So I was wondering if you had thoughts on that. You folks are in the process of trying to show the truth from perspectives, but the thing that was critical about the Truth and Reconciliation process is that it was a communication process, not just to tell the truth, but to accept the truth and the telling, and to be respectful whether or not you agreed or disagreed with the speaker. So, do you think that model might have some potential here or in Vietnam?
Well, I'm not a photojournalist, but we all know photography is not about truth, it's all fiction. So, I mean, the pictures I make are just a reflection of the way my confusions and my conflicts and the way I feel every day. So I can't say it's the truth, but it's a description of something that, yeah, well, it's a description of, I try to describe something I see in the world very well. But it doesn't necessarily mean that it still exists. Like the nun and the soldier, it's not truthful. It's in a way a figment of my imagination. But I saw something that made me want to turn it into something that was not fleeting, and immortalize that. But maybe it has.
Well, as Russell brought up, today is the 50th anniversary of Executive Order 9066, right? And the consequences of the internment are, one of the few instances in American history where I think we actually had something like a truth and reconciliation process through redress and reparations and through getting some kind of symbolic acknowledgement to the Japanese American community of what happened. But if we look at other things like genocide and colonization and slavery, we are far from reaching that moment of consensus in this country. We can just look at what's happening with Confederate memorials today, that we have debates about whether or not we should have Confederate memorials. The fact that we have debates about whether or not we should have Confederate memorials is testimony to the fact that a large portion of the American population has not committed to the truth of acknowledging slavery and its aftermath and is interested in reconciling. So I think we as a country are having a very difficult time reconciling with some of the most grievous parts of our history. And if you look at Vietnam, it's the same thing. The Vietnamese government is not interested in truth and reconciliation. The reconciliation that Vietnam is interested in, or at least the government and the Communist Party, is economic reconciliation. They want to sort of just vaguely acknowledge the past and move on so they can build more skyscrapers and get more capital investment and that kind of stuff. But, the way forward in Vietnam is to actually acknowledge that there were many people who were opposed to the current regime, and to acknowledge that there were many, Vietnamese patriots who died on the other side. Can Vietnam ever get to that stage? I'm not sure. And likewise, you see it mirrored here in the United States. The Vietnamese refugee community is not interested in truth and reconciliation with their enemies in Vietnam. It's not just the Vietnamese in Vietnam, it's the Vietnamese here as well, because they're stuck on the ethics of remembering their own. They want to remember only their pain, only what happened to them. They're not interested in what happened to the other side. And so the Vietnamese people in Vietnam and all over the world are very, very far from truth and reconciliation. The models exist, but as a whole, the Communist Party and the exiled Vietnamese are not interested in truth and reconciliation.
I mean, Americans are further ahead reconciling with the Vietnamese, and they get their ships repaired there. It's strategy, of course, but and then they started training together.
Yeah, I mean, ironically, that's one of the things that's interesting is that, the United States is at least a little bit more interested in confronting the atrocities that happened there because of the United States. And we don't have a consensus on that, but there's much more openness, much more willingness to explore that, but only through centering American experiences, not through acknowledging what the Vietnamese did or what was done to them.
Okay, so we have time for one last question. So this person over there was very persistent in the back. Yes, okay. Last questions. Yes.
Thank you. I just want to thank both you guys for being here. I'm Vietnamese as well. I just want to say, how do you really cope with being American and being Vietnamese at the same time? Doing your art, you might get shunned by the Vietnamese community in San Jose or everywhere in the US. And how do you cope with that?
Well, I think it's, again, it's not about being right. So someone is not going to like your work, right? If everyone likes your work, it's probably not good. So it's something you have to deal with, and I don't.
Yeah, I mean, that's true. I think number one, if you want to be a writer or an artist, you have to have a very thick skin.
Yeah.
You're going to get a lot of rejection, starting with your own family, probably, and you have to live with that. But besides that, I think two things are important. One is vision. You have to have a vision that you believe in. So, I think part of what sustained me, over the years, as I knew I was not working in lockstep with my own communities, was my belief in what I was doing, right? And I think all artists have to have a strong vision about what they believe in terms of their beliefs, but also their artistic practice. And the other thing is solidarity. I mean, it's tough to be an artist in any circumstance, but it's even tougher when you're alone and you think you don't have a community. What you're pointing towards is, well, we seem to be stuck in between different communities. Well, how do you resolve that? You form your own communities. And that's one of the reasons why Isabel and I started, Diasporic Vietnamese Artist Network, is to build that artistic community that could tell other Vietnamese, diasporic writers and artists that they're not alone out there. There's a bunch of other weirdos who don't fit in. Join us, and we'll be a bunch of weirdos together. And that could be a model for D-Van, but if you don't see a community out there for you, make your own community.
Yeah, and a community can be very small. It could just be 3 people, it works.
Got it. 2 people. And if you want to be part of this weirdo community, please sign up over there at the